The eviction notice was a folded, sharp-edged weight in the pocket of her dark blue jeans. Amara felt its presence against her thigh with every hesitant step she took through the glowing, rain-slicked streets of Shinjuku. The paper was a promise of failure, a final warning before her world shrank to the size of a suitcase. In front of her, the address from the cryptic job posting was not a bar, not really. It was a slab of unmarked, matte black steel set into a wall of polished granite, indistinguishable from the corporate facades around it, save for its utter lack of signage. There was no name.
No welcome mat.
No hint of the life rumored to exist inside. This was a bad idea. Every instinct screamed it. The ad had been brief, posted on a board for foreign residents, offering an absurdly high hourly wage for a bartender. Cash, paid nightly. The only requirements were fluency in English and Japanese, and absolute discretion. The rumors that clung to the place were less discreet. They spoke of the Yakuza, of men who owned the night, and everything in it. They said no one kept the job for long. Amara's hand trembled as she reached for the door. The worn red wool of her sweater felt too bright, too soft for a place like this. Her landlord's face flashed in her mind, disappointed, impatient. The sharp crease of the notice in her pocket felt like a physical jab. She was 20 years old and one missed rent payment away from being completely adrift in a city of millions. She had no other options. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she pushed the door. It swung inward on silent, heavy hinges, revealing a sudden, shocking quiet. The noise of Tokyo vanished, swallowed by a room steeped in shadow and the low, mournful sigh of a lone saxophone from an unseen speaker. The air was cool and smelled of cedar, expensive leather, and something else, something clean and sharp like gin. The bar, Nocturn she'd heard it called, was a study in minimalist severity. A long counter of black marble, a wall of backlit bottles arranged with surgical precision, and a handful of leather booths, all empty. Almost empty. At the far end of the bar, a man sat alone, his back to the door. Amara's eyes snagged on him immediately. It was the suit. A dark charcoal gray, tailored so perfectly it seemed fused to his frame. The fabric draped over a set of impossibly broad shoulders and a narrow waist, a silhouette of disciplined power. He held a glass of amber liquid, his hand resting on the counter. Long, elegant fingers, a heavy, unadorned silver ring on his smallest. He did not turn. He did not move a muscle. Yet, she felt his attention land on her like a physical touch, a change in the room's pressure. The air grew heavier, colder. A nervous young man with slicked-back hair was polishing a glass behind the counter, his movements jerky and inefficient. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "You are here for the interview?" he whispered, his Japanese rushed. Before Amara could answer, a woman emerged from a back office. She was older, severe, her hair pulled into a tight, immaculate bun. Her gaze swept over Amara, taking in the cheap jeans, the soft sweater, the exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. It was not a kind look. "You are late," the woman said, her voice crisp. "My apologies." The address was difficult to locate. The woman's lips thinned. The interview was brutal and brief. She tested Amara's Japanese, her knowledge of cocktails, her ability to handle inventory. Amara answered every question calmly, her years of experience in noisy, chaotic bars serving her well. She knew she was competent. It was the only thing she had left to be. "The previous bartender," the woman said, gesturing vaguely toward the nervous young man, "was talkative. We do not tolerate that here. Our clientele values privacy above all else. Do you understand?" "I do," Amara said, her voice steady. "You will be on a trial basis. 1 week. You will be paid at the end of each shift. If you are satisfactory, you'll be offered a permanent position. If you are not, you will leave and never speak of this place to anyone." It was more of a threat than an offer. But the pay she quoted was more than Amara made in a week at her last job. It was enough. It was everything. "I understand," she said again. That was how she found herself behind the gleaming black marble an hour later, the nervous boy gone, the stern manager watching her from the office. The man in the charcoal suit had not moved. He was a statue carved from stillness and shadow. Other men began to arrive, all in similar dark, expensive suits. They moved with a quiet, predatory grace, their voices low. They would approach the man at the end of the bar, offer a short, deep bow, and then retreat to a booth. He was the sun around which these grim planets orbited. The boss. Amara focused on her work, her movements economical and smooth, polishing glasses, checking stock, her body on autopilot while her mind raced. She was in over her head. This was not just a high-end bar. It was a court. Her trial by fire came sooner than she expected. A group of 4 men swaggered in, their energy loud and abrasive, a stark contrast to the bar's hushed reverence. They were dressed differently, flashier suits, too much jewelry. They were not his. They sat at the bar, ordering top-shelf whiskey and talking loudly, their laughter grating. One of them, a man with a cruel smirk and a scar bisecting his eyebrow, let his gaze linger on Amara. "You're new," he said, his tone suggestive. "What happened to the pretty boy?" Amara ignored him, placing the drink down on the counter. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. It wasn't painful, just firm. A gesture of ownership. "I'm talking to you." Amara froze. A familiar, cold dread washed over her. This was how she'd lost her last job. A customer who wouldn't take no for an answer, a manager who blamed her for the trouble. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Before security could move, before she could even try to pull her arm away, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The low hum of conversation died. The saxophone music seemed to fade. The boss, Kaito, moved. He didn't rise from his stool so much as flow from it, a blur of silent grace. He was at her side in an instant, his presence a wall of cold fury. He didn't look at the man holding her. He looked at Amara. His eyes, she saw for the first time, were the color of dark, ancient honey, flecked with gold. They were utterly devoid of emotion. He said nothing. He simply placed his hand on the counter next to the other man's. His fingers were perfectly still. The man with the scar looked up, his smirk faltering as he finally registered who was standing beside him. The blood drained from his face. Slowly, deliberately, he released Amara's wrist. Kaito spoke, his voice so low Amara could barely hear it, a soft murmur of Japanese that held the chilling promise of violence. "You are not welcome here, Tanaka. Leave." Tanaka and his men scrambled from their stools, their bravado evaporating into sheer panic. They were gone in seconds, the door swinging shut behind them, leaving a profound, ringing silence. Kaito did not move. His gaze dropped from Amara's face to her wrist. A faint, fading bruise was visible on her skin from where her previous boss had grabbed her a week ago. A ghost of an injury. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping almost imperceptibly. He didn't comment on it, but she saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a cold, possessive anger. He turned to the manager, who had appeared at his elbow. "She stays," he said. The words were quiet, but they were an absolute command. That was it. She hadn't just passed her trial. She had been claimed. At the end of her shift, long after the last customer had gone, the manager approached her. She held out a thick envelope of cash. "Your pay for the week. An advance." "The boss insists." Amara took it, the weight of the money both a relief and a burden. "There is one more thing," the manager continued, her tone flat. "For your safety, you will be living in the apartment upstairs. A car will be here in the morning to collect your things." "It is not a request." Amara looked from the manager's implacable face toward the empty stool at the end of the bar where he had sat. She was no longer just an employee. She was under his protection. And as she stood there, in the silent, empty bar that felt more like a fortress, she realized his protection felt terrifyingly like a cage. The apartment was beautiful. It was a prison. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panorama of the glittering Tokyo skyline, a view that only reminded her of how trapped she was. The furniture was minimalist and expensive. The refrigerator was stocked, and a small wardrobe held several simple, elegant black dresses in her size. The message was clear. Her old life, her red sweater and worn jeans, did not belong here. A driver, a silent man named Ito, took her to her old apartment to collect her few belongings. He waited by the door as she packed her books and personal effects into a single box. She left the eviction notice on the kitchen counter. It felt like a relic from another person's life. She had a place to live now, but she had lost her freedom in the exchange. She had a curfew. Her movements were monitored. She was safe. She was owned. Night after night, she worked in the hushed, reverent atmosphere of Noctturn. It was Kaito's court, and she was his silent observer. She saw the hierarchy of his empire in the way men bowed, the depth of the inclination denoting their rank. She learned the language of his world not through words, but through silences, through glances, through the way a man's hand would stray to the bulge of a weapon beneath his jacket when a stranger entered. Kaito was the epicenter of it all, a figure of absolute authority who rarely raised his voice. Power radiated from his stillness. One evening, as he reached for the glass of Yamazaki she'd set before him, the cuff of his pristine white shirt shifted. For a fleeting second, she saw it, the intricate, blue-black scales of a dragon's tail coiling around his wrist. The ink disappeared back under the cuff, but the image was seared into her mind. He wasn't just a businessman with powerful friends. He was the head of the family, the boss. She began to see him as something other than a terrifying enigma. She noticed the way his eyes would track her movements as she worked, a silent, constant assessment. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes that were not there at the start of the night. She learned his habits. One glass of whiskey, nursed for hours. He never drank to excess. He was always in control. One night, a courier delivered a small, lacquered box. Kaito was in his usual corner, reviewing a ledger. He took the box, his expression unreadable. He dismissed the courier with a curt nod. As Amara polished glasses at the other end of the bar, pretending not to watch, she saw him open it. He froze. It was the first time she had ever seen his composure crack. His entire body went rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the bar. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, perfect white camellia. Amara's breath caught. Behind the bar, on a low shelf hidden from view, was a small, silver-framed photograph she discovered while cleaning. It was the only personal item in the entire establishment. The photo was of a smiling young woman with kind eyes, a white camellia tucked behind her ear. Kaito never looked at it, but he always knew if it had been moved. He closed the box with a sharp snap, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, but his dark honey eyes were bleak, haunted. Later, hidden in the shadows of the hallway leading to the stockroom, she overheard two of his most trusted lieutenants speaking in hushed, angry tones. "Tanaka is a dog," one said. "To send that, on this day of all days." "It's the anniversary," the other replied, his voice grim. "He's taunting the boss." A tasteless reminder of what happened to Akemi. Akemi. The name hit Amara with the force of a physical blow. The woman in the photograph. The camellia was not a gift. It was a weapon, a shard of memory wielded by a rival. It was a symbol of a failure, a wound that had never healed. She finally understood the source of the coldness that clung to him, the shame he wore like a second skin beneath the tailored suits. He was a man who had failed to protect someone, and he had never forgiven himself. The rivals were not content with psychological warfare. The danger became real, and it came for her. On her one approved weekly trip to a local market, a black sedan with tinted windows swerved onto the sidewalk, its engine roaring. It headed directly for her. Time seemed to slow. Amara saw the glint of the sun on the windshield, the impassive face of the driver. Ito, her silent shadow, reacted with astonishing speed. He grabbed her, yanking her back into the doorway of a shop with a force that knocked the wind out of her. The car sped past, missing her by inches, and disappeared into traffic. Shaking, her heart hammering, Amara leaned against the cool stone of the building. Ito stood in front of her, a human shield, his hand still on his sidearm. The message was brutally clear. They knew who she was to him. They were no longer just testing his boundaries, they were actively trying to hurt his possessions. That evening, the stern manager, Mrs. Sato, found her in the empty apartment, staring out at the city lights. There was an uncharacteristic softness in the older woman's eyes. "This has gone too far," Mrs. Sato said quietly. "He would not want an innocent person harmed because of his world. I can arrange a flight for you. To America. Anywhere you want to go. There will be money, enough to start a new life. Far from all this," she placed a thick envelope on the table. "This is your chance to leave. No one will stop you." Amara stared at the envelope. Freedom. A clean break. She could go back to being the girl worried about rent, but she would be free. She thought of the life of struggle she'd left behind. Then, she thought of Kaito's face when he saw the camellia. The flicker of raw, human pain beneath the layers of ice. She saw the ghost of a woman named Akemi. In that moment, staying felt less like a surrender and more like an act of defiance. She was not Akemi. She would not be a ghost that haunted him. She pushed the envelope back across the table. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm.
"I'm stay."
Mrs. Sato looked at her a long, searching gaze. She nodded slowly, as if Amara had just passed some final, unspoken test. Later that night, Kaito found her in the narrow confines of the stockroom. She was taking inventory, her hands not quite steady as she counted bottles of expensive scotch. He filled the doorway, a dark silhouette against the light of the bar. The small space became charged, the air thick with unspoken words. "They tried to hurt you," he stated. It was not a question. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice tight, refusing to look at him. He stepped inside, and the room shrank to nothing. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and smoke that always clung to him. He reached out, not to her, but to a bottle of gin she had almost knocked from the shelf. His fingers brushed against hers as he steadied it. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. "You are not fine," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. He waited until she finally lifted her head to meet his gaze. "But you will be." In the depths of his dark honey eyes, she saw it again. Not just the cold predator who ruled Tokyo's underworld, but a fierce, desperate protector. And for the first time, she wasn't sure which one was more dangerous. The war escalated. A week later, during peak hours, the bar's private line rang. Mrs. Sato answered, her face going pale. "Everyone out," she commanded, her voice sharp with urgency.
"Now."
A bomb threat. Panic erupted, a wave of fear rippling through the disciplined calm of Nocturn. Kaito's men moved with practiced efficiency, herding the wealthy patrons toward the exits. In the chaos, Amara saw it. A lone man, not part of the fleeing crowd, but moving against it. He was dressed as a waiter, but his eyes were fixed on Kaito with a chilling intensity. He raised his arm, and she saw the metallic glint of a gun. Time fractured. Kaito was focused on the evacuation, his back partially turned. His men were occupied. He was vulnerable. Amara didn't think. She acted. She shoved a heavy, wheeled bar cart laden with bottles with all her might. It careened across the floor, slamming into the gunman just as he fired. The shot went wide, shattering a mirror on the far wall. An instant later, 2 of Kaito's soldiers were on the man, disarming him with brutal efficiency. The immediate threat was over. But for a split second, a heartbeat, Kaito had been exposed, and she had been the one to shield him. He turned, his eyes finding hers across the chaotic room. The look he gave her was new, raw, sharp, and stripped of all pretense. It was a look of stark recognition. They dragged the gunman to the basement. Amara knew, with a sickening certainty, what awaited him there. The bar was empty now, save for Kaito and his inner circle. The air was thick with the aftermath of violence. Kaito approached her, his face a cold, hard mask. "Did you see who he was talking to before he drew the weapon?" he asked. His voice was precise, surgical, lethal. Amara's blood ran cold. She had seen. Just before the chaos, she'd seen the fake waiter exchange a few quiet words with Kenji, a young, fresh-faced soldier who had always been kind to her, who sometimes asked her about America. He was a traitor. Lying now would be suicide. Telling the truth would be a death sentence for Kenji. She was standing on a precipice. She looked at Kaido, at the absolute, unforgiving certainty in his eyes. This was his world. To survive in it, she had to abide by its rules. She took a breath. "Kenji," she said, her voice a low whisper. He was talking to Kenji. She had done it. She had passed judgment. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, her voice becoming a weapon in his brutal justice. She was no longer just an observer. She was an accomplice. Hours later, after the building had been swept and the traitor had been dealt with, Amara stood on the rooftop garden above the bar. The cool night wind whipped loose strands of her hair across her face, the glittering sprawl of Tokyo, a cold comfort below. She heard his footsteps behind her, but didn't turn. "You could have lied," Kaido said, his voice quiet, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "You could have said you saw nothing." "What good would that have done?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He would have tried again. He was silent for a long moment, the space between them charged with the night's violence and her complicity. His presence was a solid, grounding weight against the vast emptiness of the sky. "I told myself keeping you here was for your safety," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "A reason to justify taking you from your life." He turned to face her, his eyes dark and intense in the moonlight. "It was a lie. I kept you here because I wanted you here." It was not a declaration of love. It was a confession of possession, of a selfish desire so profound it had reshaped her entire world. It was more honest and far more dangerous. The enemy's retaliation was swift and personal. A few days later, Ito approached her with a grim expression, holding a tablet. On the screen was a news report. A fire in her old, working-class neighborhood. An image showed the charred, hollowed-out shell of her former apartment building. The police suspected arson. But Kaido's men had gotten there first. They had sent her a private photo of the interior wall of her unit. Scrawled in soot and ash was a message: "We know where you find your strays." They had burned her past to the ground. They were trying to erase her, to prove that she had no life, no history, outside of him. The war was no longer just his. They had made her the battlefield. Kaido learned where Tanaka, the rival boss, would be. It was a high-stakes meeting at a neutral, traditional tea house in Kyoto, a place governed by old rules of honor. Kaido knew it was a trap, but it was one he had to walk into to sever the head of the snake. He forbade her from coming, his order absolute and cold. "You will remain here. You are not a part of this." She disobeyed. For the first time, she actively defied him. Listening to the whispers and fragmented plans in the bar, she had pieced together the location. While he and his men prepared for war, she prepared for something else. She took a bullet train to Kyoto alone. She traded her severe black dress for simple tourist clothes, becoming anonymous. She knew she couldn't fight, but she could think. She arrived at the tea house moments before Kaido's convoy. The place was serene, all clean lines of wood and paper screens, belying the tension coiling within. Tanaka's men were already in position, disguised as staff and guests. Amara walked straight to the entrance, affecting a panicked, lost tourist persona. In loud, frantic English, she accosted the host, waving a map and asking for directions, creating a small, believable, and utterly disruptive scene. The guards at the door were distracted, annoyed. It was a tiny tear in their web of preparation, but it was enough. Kaido's convoy arrived during the commotion, throwing off the precise timing of Tanaka's ambush by a crucial few seconds. The first gunshot shattered the tea house's tranquility. The ambush was sprung, but imperfectly. A chaotic firefight erupted. Amara was knocked to the ground in the ensuing panic. Instead of crawling to safety, she watched. Kaido and his men were pinned down near the entrance. Through a shattered screen, she saw Tanaka, the man with the scar, making a break for it through a private rock garden at the side of the building. Scrambling to her feet, she followed. She grabbed a heavy, jagged piece of steel rebar from the damaged entryway frame, the metal cold and rough in her hands. She found him in the serene garden, barking orders into a phone, his back to her. He was calling for an escape that would never come. He heard her and turned, a dismissive sneer on his face. The little bartender. You have a death wish. He turned away again, deeming her insignificant. That was his mistake. With a cry torn from her throat, a sound of pure rage and terror, Amara swung the rebar with all her strength. It connected with the back of his knee with a sickening crunch. He screamed, collapsing to the manicured gravel, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. She didn't kill him. She crippled him. She didn't save Kaido with a gun, but with intelligence, with desperation, and by being the one person he completely underestimated. Moments later, Kaido found her. She was standing over the groaning, defeated form of his rival, the steel bar still clutched in her white-knuckled grip, her chest heaving. Blood stained the serene white rocks. Kaido's eyes took in the scene, his enemy, broken at her feet. He looked at her, and in that moment, he no longer saw a liability to be protected. He saw a queen on a battlefield of her own making. He walked past Tanaka, without a glance, stopping directly in front of her. Gently, he took the rebar from her hand, his fingers closing over hers. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a gesture of profound, silent acknowledgement. The debt is paid, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He wasn't talking about Tanaka. He was talking about the ghost of a white camellia, about the shame he carried for Akemi. Amara hadn't just ended a war. She had granted him absolution. He said her name then, Amara, and it sounded different from ever before. Not a claim of possession. A statement of fact. Her name, in his world. The war was over. Tanaka's clan was shattered, its remnants absorbed into Kaido's empire. But victory had a cost. Kenji was gone. The beautiful bar was scarred with bullet holes. And Amara's old life, her old self, was nothing but ashes. The innocence of the girl who was just worried about rent had been burned away in the violence she had witnessed and the violence she had committed. That was the price. Weeks later, Nocturn was reborn. The scars were gone, replaced by sleeker, more formidable design. The black marble was polished to a higher sheen, the shadows deeper. Amara stood behind the bar. She was not wearing a soft red sweater, but a simple, impeccably tailored black dress that felt like armor. The door opened, and Kaido entered. The low murmur of the room quieted, the very air shifting to accommodate his presence. He did not go to his corner stool. He walked the length of the bar and sat directly in front of her. The few patrons present averted their eyes, granting them an illusion of privacy. He didn't order a drink. He simply watched her as she polished a crystal glass, her movements now calm, sure and steady. The silence between them was no longer heavy with tension or unspoken threats. It was a shared space, filled with the truth of everything they had survived. He slid a small, black velvet box across the polished counter. It stopped just before her hand. It was not a ring box. Her heart gave a single, hard thump as she opened it. Inside, nestled on black silk, was a single, heavy key of modern, minimalist design. It was not for the apartment upstairs. She knew, instinctively, it was for the main penthouse, his private residence, a place no one ever entered. It was not a proposal. It was not a command.
It was a choice. Stay.
Not as a protected employee or a prized possession, but as an equal, as his. Amara looked up from the key to his dark, waiting eyes. She saw the vast, dangerous world he commanded, and she saw her place in it, carved out by her own hands. She closed her hand around the cool, solid metal of the key. Its weight was real. It was a promise. Without a word, she slid it into the pocket of her dress. Then she picked up her polishing cloth and returned to her work, her movements graceful and certain. She was home.